world exposure to GPS technology in athletes, that was a quarter century ago. Like it has not been that long ago. And we've seen now, like force plate technology didn't really exist in the strength and conditioning space. That was in the biomechanical lab space, like physics classrooms. Like that was not in strength and conditioning centers until the last decade. Like we're seeing such a rapid growth. We see wearable technology with whoops and auras, or like whoop bands and aura rings and all this stuff as well. We're seeing a rapid growth and an accelerated growth in sports technology. That to me is going to lead to a fork in the road.
Welcome to the Winning Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Schwartzman. I'm a family man, a coach, a wannabe athlete. After earning 3 master's degrees and countless certifications, I've decided that podcasting is how I'm going to continue my education in all things wellness, longevity, and performance. Join me to learn along. Today's guest is Dr. Kyle Sunderland. We discuss load management, the science of training athletes for successful performance.
An associate professor of exercise science at Sunderland-Winning University is kind of my official title. Unofficially, I'm also the sports scientist for several teams on campus. Really got to this position I grew up being an athlete, and I always say I was that annoying athlete. I never got out of my 4-year-old self of like, why do things happen? I always wanted to know more. It's probably being the son of a coach, the son of a nurse, kind of led me down this path. And so as I continued to ask this through my own athletic career, when I was in college, ran the 800 in track and field, and started to ask sports nutrition questions and supplementation questions about what could improve my performance. And that really led me to my master's degree, where I studied a little bit of that stuff. Still wanted to know more why. And so I continued on. I just loved learning it and continued on into a PhD that allowed me to mess around with some molecular biology and biochemistry. And my first job out, I was at a small private university in North Carolina that I worked in a human biomechanics and physiology laboratory. So I've really been exposed to a number of things, starting being my own background of an athlete, questioning why, questioning and wondering supplements, programs, different workouts, and how we perform optimally. Got to understand the molecular changes that may occur. And then I also got exposed to some of the biomechanics and some of that stuff with my first job. So that really led me to a large interest to circle back with athletes at a more macro scale, and now have this well-rounded approach of an understanding biomechanically, physiologically, and then now getting more into like recovery and mental well-being and things like that. It allows me to work through the holistic athlete. And so it's kind of where I wanted to be, is at a place like this where in academics I could still kind of, extend the olive branch, if you will, to athletics and really work with our student athletes directly.
I know having an overlapping time with you at Linwood, you just kind of started showing up and making your way over to the weight room and just helping out and having more conversations. Sharing education, accruing like technology. I think you were grabbing maybe some grants for some tech that the university was not buying outright. It was coming through your resourcefulness, I guess we'd call it. And then as you were helping out more and more, a few of the teams started doing a little bit better. And kind of what's going on. Who are you working with now, and maybe some highlights of the last couple of years with some of those teams?
Yeah, so I started in 2021, and as you said, at least working directly with the team in 2021. The background stuff started before that. I was interested in pursuing some technology, some sports science technology, and I was looking for teams to be able to work with. And thankfully, in class, I had a great undergraduate exercise science student, Paige Sutton, who's now in her PhD at Oklahoma State. But she kind of kick-started it all with me, that like she was a lacrosse athlete. I met with their coaching staff and said, hey, I'm going to write this grant and get some, GPS heart rate sensors to be able to see, would you guys be interested? And they just happened to always be, I guess they had told me like they had always kind of been looking at this, but never really had the knowledge base to be able to utilize it or do anything with it. And so it provided a wonderful opportunity. And so that was kind of my first start, was working with women's lacrosse. in that 2021 season. And thankfully, as we started working together, like that season was a season that we won a D2 national title, the first and only NCAA team national title at Lindenwood. And it just kind of fills out from there. Like, good news spreads, and started working with more teams. So now I work very directly still, obviously, primarily with women's lacrosse, but I also now work directly with women's soccer, directly with men's soccer. And I help out with a lot of other teams. I help out some of the sports technology and sports science stuff with like men's and women's basketball, with rugby, women's ice hockey, track and field getting into, right? So like anywhere where I feel I can be of help, where coaches are willing and wanting support on the sports science side of things, like I try and jump into. I try and support as much as I can our student athletes. But yeah, so like that again, like this season of soccer was my second season working with women's soccer, my first season working with men's soccer. And women's soccer this year goes on to win the OVC tournament. So that's the first Division One conference title. That was the first Division One conference title at Lindenwood. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been successful. And I think that, when athletic staffs do things right and put the student athlete in the center of everything, success is going to follow. So that's really what we've seen at Lindenwood.
And if you're talking about the staff, and maybe some places might call it like the high performance unit, or they want a high performance unit. If you've got a strength coach, an athletic trainer, and your sport coach, and maybe there's a mental health professional, if they're all doing their best and they're experts at what they do, what are some warning signs or some indicators that maybe that sports scientist can come in and elevate the staff's performance?
Yeah, I think there's a number of areas that a sports scientist assists. Like really, when you look at what a sports scientist can do, is that I think it improves collaboration and communication channels through all of those different professional areas. We always say like sports scientists are kind of, we have a broad background. We tend to be a master of one or two areas, whether it be nutrition, biomechanics, physiology, mental wellness, recovery, like things like that. So we tend to have one expert area, but we tend to have a real well-rounded. So we're able to communicate with a lot of different areas and speak the language to a lot of different staff members. And so we kind of can bring people together and improve communication channels, I think it's one of the primary things I think about in our communication or in our work within our units. Warning signs that I always tell kind of coaching staffs, or things I hear, I should say, out of coaching staffs that tell me like we need more support in this area, tends to be when we don't recognize the strain. And so I tend to speak a lot about stress and strain. And when we see, like, an example that I see is mid-season or just over mid-season in, and we start to see a drop in performance, we start to see, as many coaches would recognize, a lack in fitness or fatigue or things like that that are kind of bumping up in teams. Little injuries start to pop up. Once we start to see, especially, like I said, that mid-season mark or around there, when we start to see some of these things, whether it be fatigue that didn't exist in the first opening months or injuries that are coming up now, that's where I think a sports scientist can help in being able to understand and put together a process and a structure to gather data and use that data to potentially make, hopefully, data-informed decision making through that process to avoid that drop off. So that's what I look at, I don't really say I look for those warning signs. I hear those warning signs out of coaching staffs when they're like, our team is not fit enough, and you're 3/4 of the way through the season. Your team's probably fit enough. Maybe they're tired.
Yeah, I know. I know as a strength coach myself and others, when you don't have those other experts, and it's one big umbrella. Like, okay, I'm the strength coach, but I might talk to them, not stepping out of bounds, but I might talk to them about mental health. I might talk to them about nutrition, and the nutritionist might talk to them about exercise, and everybody kind of shares responsibilities a little bit. I know myself and other strength coaches, we might really try to get that second hat on, but the dream world is that everybody is being a rock star within their lane. And this is kind of a leading question a little bit here, if you don't mind sharing, because one thing for me, that when you started bringing out some of these like data metrics, like maybe like some of the GPS data, and then you have these charts that are easy to read. You look, oh, the timeline, the amount of work that was done, whether it's the heart rate or the amount of high speed running that was involved. If you don't mind walking us through that a little bit, because as a strength coach, when you were showing those to me, it was so much easier to see what the heck is going on in practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the athletes are pretty good at coming in saying, today's practice was miserable. Okay, they're probably pretty accurate if it's miserable, but it's not as quantifiable as maybe what you'd want. So,
Yeah, and I mean that gets a little bit into stress and strain, right? So what we apply to the athlete is the stress we're placing on athletes, and I'm sure we can get into more later on, just the different stresses that we place on athletes or the different stresses that athletes face. And then where you say like it's miserable, that's the strain that our athletes feel. And so, yeah, I mean, really with technology, it allows us to measure stress a lot more with our tech. We're able to say exactly how much are we applying or exactly how much are we expecting out of our athletes. And so we do have, again, I think a sports scientist is able to put together a plan. And so I'll kind of share my screen really quickly with you
absolutely.
to show like one of the ones that we put together. So as we put together our plan, can you see this? Is all good?
Yep.
So as we put together our plan, like these are some of the charts that you mentioned. This is largely looking at total distance for us with our soccer teams through the fall. And so we look at kind of every day and how we build and what you see in the line. So the bar graphs is kind of our everyday strain, our everyday distance that our athletes are running. The line that we see going across is a cumulative distance across a week, across a 7-day period. And so you could see it builds through midseason, traditional like linear periodization. We build that through the midseason and then we taper off towards the championship season. And so we're able to show coaches this, like this is maybe what it looks like. This is, I think up top is from the previous, or this is from our fall build up for lacrosse. This is for down here, our build through the fall with soccer. And so we kind of need to establish in our plan, like what stresses we're placing on them, and do we have positive adaptation with our athletes? And so I always say we have two opportunities when we're trying to avoid the overreaching or overtraining or to avoid some of the injury risk that we may face late in the season. We pick where we start and we pick how we build. Depends a lot on the background of our athletes, but we traditionally start, from a metric perspective, and we could talk about more of the metrics later on. If we have the technology like we do here with GPS, we're able to start with what essentially is 1 to 1.5 times of a game volume. So I always say, like, we start with what is a game? What's the game expectation on us? And in soccer, we know you can see some of the games that I have here in our Lindenwood Gold is about 10 kilometers or 6 miles for a lot of our athletes. And so we know the game expectation is about 10 kilometers. Well, start your training there. Start your off-season training at about whatever a game load is, and that's for a week, right? So if you have 3 training sessions, that means about 3 kilometers or 2 miles per training session, and then increase and progress the way that, we traditionally would in the weight room or anywhere else, where you look at, somewhere between a 10 and a 30% jump in workload every week. And so depending on how aggressive you want to be or where you want to be. So we'll jump up about 20% every week on average. If we have a nice long build in, we'll kind of increase that by 10% just to make it a smoother transition for our athletes. If you look at like soccer, where they jump right into the season, well, our progression is a little bit different. Our starting point is a little higher and our progression potentially is a little faster. So like that's, again, from a technology perspective and some of the charts and what we're able to do on the sports science side of things is be able to present coaching staffs with this type of information to see, like, if we look at all these training sessions for lacrosse, we have very specific moments of time where we're trying to go hard, right? So we have these spikes throughout here where it's like we need to push the athlete and see what they have. You can see the spike always follows with kind of a deload. And so we always make sure we stress them, and then we monitor the strain, which again is what you're talking about, like, that felt awful. And so if I like look later on, this is a presentation I gave in December. This is how we kind of monitor our strain. And so we're looking at overall athlete wellness. We're able to ask those questions, and say, how tired are we? How sore are we? What are our overall stress levels? What's our overall mood look like? Things like that, to look at the strain on our athletes and see what's that stress strain relationship. And again, early season, when we may be pushing athletes pretty hard, we put high stresses on them. They may respond very well and not experience a lot of strain because they're very fresh. They haven't been overloaded too much, but that workload compiles over the season. And then we need to monitor that same training session that we did in August. If we do it again in October, we may see a different strain. They may feel differently now because of the accumulation effect through the season. And so I think, like, coming into a team or doing some of this, like, we need to be able to understand our stresses. Again, we have the technology to be able to do it. If you have GPS, if you have Catapult, if you have Stat Sports, Titan, like, there's a whole bunch of companies out there. We use Polar. There's a bunch of companies that can do it. But if we're monitoring in that way, we could put a very precise number on what our stress that we're placing on our athletes, and we can control that stress. I think, personally, as a sports scientist, my philosophy is we better understand the strain even more than the stress, and we can react with changes in stress based on the strain our athletes are feeling and experiencing. So that's where I say we need to put the athlete in the center and ask them, how are they feeling? How are they responding? And we can measure some of that we can kind of get into later on as well. But I think we can start with just asking the athlete that. And I think it's important as strength coaches to do that. The athletes come in and say, hey, how was practice today? And understand, like, what strains they're feeling.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, we should not do an entire summer's worth of conditioning in the first 10 days.
Yeah. It's definitely a challenge. And we have a lot of those conversations when you talk about the initiation of training, obviously in a collegiate setting, high school setting, club is a little bit different as they go a little more year round. Having an understanding of where our athletes are at when they return to our campuses is very important. And that may determine where you start. If I use my two main team examples of lacrosse returns in the fall, they don't play until the spring. We don't have a heavy expectation that they return to campus in August in the best of shape.
Yeah.
We have 5 or 6 months to build them into that type of shape. And so that's where we start low, we build slow. And towards the end of fall, I always say, I want to build to where they experience a little bit. They get a touch of what the spring is going to look like, and we can shut them down. And then I can monitor that strain through the next week or two to see, how does our team respond now that we've built them up here? And that's going to determine what we come in the spring. So that's a situation where, like, no, absolutely we can't push them too hard because they do not have the cumulative adaptations returning here to be able to handle that type of stuff. Soccer, on the other hand, they got to jump right into it. And so we may start a little bit higher, but we have an expectation that they return to campus potentially a little more fit. But that's where, again, that communication, that understanding, and potentially that assessment when they get back to campus to understand where they're at, is very important. And I think where we start in training needs to be determined by, we need to meet our athletes where they're at. And whether that be, again, a no-cost solution, we ask them. Other no-cost solutions that, again, it's how you interpret things. I think at times is, people talk about cardio fitness tests or strength tests or whatever it may be as we return to campus. Uh, a lot of people don't like them. I don't mind them. I always say there's no bad assessment. It's just bad interpretation of assessment results. You run a fitness test when they return to campus. I appreciate that if you use that information correctly. And that information used correctly says, where can we start our athletes at based on how fit they are? I don't want to approach the athletes that this is a test, and a test implies pass fail.
Sure.
I don't like placing that type of stress on our athletes. I like saying, listen, there's no expectation here, but in order for us to properly place you and build you, we need to understand where you're at now. Because if you aren't in shape right now, like me as a sports scientist, I'm not going to yell at you. That's not, I just know that then we may need to progress a little bit differently with you, to make sure that we don't overwork you, overload you, overstress you, and potentially end up with that mid-season fatigue, that mid-season stress reaction, stress fracture, those mid-season colds and flus that come on. Like those are the types of things that happen when you just throw that whole season worth of training in the first 10 days.
Yeah.
You aren't going to see it in those first 10 days. You're going to see it a month later.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite assessment? Is it a 1 mile assessment, or is it a beep test of sorts, or?
Yeah, I mean, I always say, I'm a purist when it comes to exercise assessments, especially cardio. My background is track and field, so running assessments I'm really fond of, and I told a little bit near and dear of like what we do and why we do it. Although many people kind of throw it out, like I would say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater type of situation of like, I'm not an opponent to, and I actually appreciate the straight mile time trial. Any linear time trial test, if you want to understand a cardiovascular fitness, that's the only way to execute it. When you look at the beep tests and things like that, you throw in other factors that may result in athletes not performing as well on that test that are outside of cardiovascular fitness. When you start changing direction and doing those things, or throwing in like the intermittent, like the yo-yo test, you add in rest periods. Well, now how quickly does someone recover? How quickly does someone accelerate and decelerate? Like that adds a component to have the results of those tests that are not cardiovascular. And so I always say it depends on really what you want to look at. If you want to look at the cardiovascular fitness, you kind of just need to get on a track and run a straight line and run in a circle. And like, it's the only way to really truly measure it. If you want it more sports specific and you throw in those change of directions, you just need to understand that there may be reasons for better performances than others that are not cardio.
Could you talk a little bit more about you're using stress and strain? Would stress be like what they're doing and strain be how they feel from it?
Yeah.
And then how are you quantifying strain?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think that's the thing that varies the most in sports science right now. Yeah, when you kind of go back, like not digging into it too much, but you go to physics principles, I apply stress onto a metal bar. That's the stress, the force I'm applying to it. The strain is the reaction of the bar to that stress. And so when we apply a stress to an athlete, whether it be a lifting session, a training session, we can apply stresses academically. We can apply stresses through nutrition. We can apply stresses through recovery or lack thereof. Like that's our stress component and is way more measurable. We can measure stress very well and very objectively. And I think that's what the boom in sports technology has largely done, is allowed us, especially GPS technology, has allowed us to measure stress and quantify stress on the field very, very, very well, or on the field or on the court or on the ice or whatever it may be, very, very, very well. Strain, how the athletes respond, that's the sports scientist's life. I think really, it's definitely a big part, I think, of a strength and conditioning coach's life. It's a big part, obviously, of an athletic trainer's life. Um, I think it's key to success. And when you look at teams that are successful and teams that may not be, um, one of the common threads that I've seen, whether it be with our teams or with teams that I talk to, other strength coaches or sports scientists or alike, is we understand the stress strain relationship. And we understand how to back off stress when athletes become strained. And so the strain measure is varied across sports science. I tend to use a very standardized survey that's called the Hooper Index. So Sue Hooper in 1995 came up with it. We used an adopted version that was adopted. There was an alteration to it in 2010 that we started to use. And it's a simple 5-question survey. It is, how tired are we? How do our muscles feel today? Asking about soreness. What are our stress levels today? What's our overall mood today? And how well did we sleep last night? We ask those on a 5-point scale with half-point increments. It gets us, and then we look at it individually. We add all those numbers together to say a wellness, what we term wellness, or you could term it strain if you want. That out of 25 allows us to kind of rank order or stoplight color athletes or whatever it may be. And I always say, like, this is where I tell coaching staffs, use this data to understand your athlete. Don't use this data to play or not play your athlete, because some of this stuff may be off field, off court, off competition reasons. They may be going through academic stress. Like we just had one that's applying to internships. That's a great amount of stress on her right now. She's never done it before. That's leading her to stay up late at night, so she's not sleeping quite as well. And because she didn't sleep quite as well, she might be a little tired. And so the fatigue score is a little low. And so like some of that may be off, but like off field, off competition surface. But coaching staffs can use that to understand their athletes. And I always say, don't poke the bear when they're already down. Like, this is where we need to uplift maybe a little bit more, be more positive, understand and encourage a little bit more, have it as a conversation starter when we understand that. And then collectively as a team, if we understand fatigue, stress, or fatigue, soreness, stress, mood, and sleep quality, like we can understand what advice we can give to a team, because someone may be feeling bad for different reasons. They may feel like their legs are logs, and that's fatigue, or they may feel their legs are in pain, like soreness, and we may need to provide, whether it be as high performance professionals, if you will, we may provide different advice and outsource to different people based on what they're telling us. But we need to ask that question, and that typically is that's what we ask as far as as far as measuring strain in our athletes is what we call the Hooper Index.
Here's a conversation that I was having 15 years ago. I get to spend a little bit of time with the St. Louis Rams and their head strength coach, Rock Gullickson. He and I were talking about, as Polar was starting to do things like more than just heart rate measuring, they're starting to do the GPS and other things like that. He said, there's this philosophy that when an athlete's underprepared, you decrease their training. And he said, my main concern with that is that you are rewarding them being unprepared. It's like when it's game day, it doesn't matter if they're prepared or not. They have a job to do. And so I like that is just like burned in my head. I'm like, I just think about it all the time. I'm like, gosh, it's really important to be nice to these athletes and respect their status. But what if there's not internships and being a responsible adult? What if it's video games and drinking alcohol? And like, what do you do with the athlete who's just they're showing up unprepared?
Yeah, and I mean that's the tricky situation. And I think a lot of people look at sports scientists like when I walked into a coaching staff somewhat recently, like in my recent past, that their experience with sports scientists has always been kind of what you talk about there. We experience it, we see this response and we decrease workload. So they kind of viewed a sports scientist as someone that would always hold them back. And like my thing is always that's where I kind of said early on, like we need to understand the game demands. First and foremost, if you're going to start anywhere in this world of data collection and trying to prepare the stress of an athlete and build a stress of an athlete up, we need to understand what a game demand looks like. Once we understand that, then we can progress from there. Then we can build towards that. And so we know the game, we know the demand of the game. And I tell them, like, we need to be able to take the athletes up to the demand of the game, up to the red line, if you will, but not push it over that. How much is enough? How strong is strong enough? How fit is fit enough? How agile is agile enough? Like things like that we need to be able to understand, so that we don't overtrain, but we aren't under preparing as well. And so I think this is where having an outside source, and it's kind of what I tell all of our athletes here, is I understand the athlete's plight. I was a college athlete at one point. When you're faced with someone that makes game time decisions, like your head coach, even your assistant coach, and you're having this conversation, you're expected to tell them certain things. I understand maybe potentially bending the truth a little bit, because your game time demand, like your game time may be reliant upon that answer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So this is where like your support staff, like a sports scientist, or if you kind of delegate that responsibility to anyone amongst the support staff, that's where they're vital. And I tell our athletes in every meeting, every first year, beginning of the year meeting that I have with them, listen, I'm not here. I don't make, if you talk to any of our coaching staffs, at no point have I ever said someone should play or shouldn't play. At no point do I have control over any of that. I know that, like in a soccer game, there are 11 starters that will step on that field. And I know that they're going to be expected to step on that field every Thursday and every Sunday. My job and my relationship with them needs to be honest, because I'm here to support the athlete first and foremost. And I'm here to educate and support and help the coaching staff and the athlete. But my center is on the athlete. And so when I ask those questions, or if I see those responses, I need to see those responses because I can provide the advice to why you may not be feeling well. My job is to support the coaching staff to get you guys prepared properly for the demand of the game, kind of what you mentioned there. My role with the athletes is to make sure that they feel good during that preparation, during that buildup, during that demand. And I can't help them do that if I don't understand that they aren't sleeping well. They may be drinking, they may not be eating well. Again, our job is to provide as much education as possible to make the right decision. Ultimately, when it comes to off-field stuff, we can't make that decision for the athletes. But they need to understand how that will influence their performance, which will influence the coach's decision, right? So I'm an educator first. I want to educate our athletes to make the right decision. I can't feed them. I can't be down at Main Street, our main kind of gathering place on weekends with them, telling them, don't do that. Like, I can't do those things. I need them to be educated enough to know that if I make this decision, what it's going to do tomorrow, what it's going to do this week in training, and how that may affect my preparation. Then they're college athletes, they're high school athletes, they're elite athletes. They make the decisions that they want to make.
Yeah. This is kind of a specific question. Would you maybe spend a little bit more time talking about how you measure and utilize information such as heart rates and also not just ground covered, but like high speed running?
Yeah. So I'll share once again. This is ultimately like what I share here is these are reports that I give to my coaching staffs that I work with our heart rate and GPS data. So it's always important. Like this is from the fall, obviously, with our women's soccer team. Um, so we look daily and we look weekly, right? Again, you're kind of looking at um, what's our daily stress and what have we been adapted to be able to handle. So where's our resilience essentially on the right is all of our weekly stuff. And so in any sport, you have to understand KPIs. So these are KPIs, our key performance indicators from a big field, big pitch perspective. So when I look at soccer, when I look at lacrosse, my main two sports, these are the KPIs that we come up with that are typically traditionally used. These numbers or these values, these metrics would definitely change if we went like to the basketball arena or if we go to hockey or if we do something like that. But when we look at like the soccer arena and on the pitch, so we do look at obviously the total distance number, like you talked about there, Mitch. We also look at high speed distance. So I say like you shouldn't have too many key performance indicators. 3 to 5 starts to stretch it, but I kind of settle on 4. So I have a volume metric that I look at. That's total distance. I have a high speed distance. So how much ground is covered at in high speeds. It's a little bit more of an anaerobic metric, an intensity metric, if you will. And so high speed distance, that threshold of what's fast and what's not fast varies a little bit, but certain sports it's more standardized than others. So typically in female big pitch sports, it is like about 15 kilometers an hour or just under 10 miles an hour. Men's soccer is way more regimented. Like men's soccer, they've been studied for decades now. Those are way more standardized thresholds of 19.8 kilometers an hour for high speed and 22.1 kilometers an hour for sprint speed distances. So like it varies, but you can kind of set your thresholds wherever you want. My preference is to set that high speed threshold. Again, I like to say cardio and anaerobic. And so if you do a beep test or you do a mile time trial and you know, like in the beep test as an example, where they finish, the speed of the level at which they finish that test, above that is now anaerobic, 100% anaerobic. So if you want to have a true relative threshold, that's our threshold for high speed running in my mind. So we have our volume metric, we have our intensity metric or anaerobic metric. It goes way back to the 80s of ACSMs, heart rate, intensity of exercise stuff, where it's like time spent above 85% maximal heart rate is that vigorous intensity exercise. In intermittent sport, we can't look at average heart rate. We can't do any of that type stuff because it just doesn't make sense with the intermittent nature. So we actually use time spent above 90% maximal heart rate in these very high intensity sports. That's my cardio metric. So I'm able to see how cardiovascularly demanding was this session. And then I also have like a neuromuscular metric, which we look at like high intensity accelerations and decelerations. And so I split them apart and I group them together. So I actually split them apart. Red is decelerations, green is accelerations, with the dashed line being the average of the sum of the two. Why I split them apart is because we need to recognize that decelerations are more energetically and neuromuscularly demanding than accelerations are. And so if we have more decelerations than accelerations, no matter what the overall cumulative number is, that was a more demanding session. And so I'm able to look at volume, intensity, cardio, and neuromuscular within my daily sessions, and then kind of feed that back and provide advice on what these sessions may look like or what we expect to see, or be able to contextualize what we see in our athletes' responses to those strain questions that we ask, those wellness questions that we ask. If we had a lot of decelerations in a day and they tell us the next morning they're sore, that makes sense. This is why they're sore. Maybe we need to back off the decelerations tomorrow. If they put in a lot of volume and they put in a lot of like time above 90% max heart rate, and they're telling me tomorrow morning that they're tired, that makes sense. We need to discuss backing off the volume. We need to discuss different nutritional strategies, those types of things to be able to get them back. So that's kind of our session. On the right, it gets a little more complex. Like I said, I look at rolling 7-day to be able to understand like what are we doing today versus what they've done over the last 7 days is really important when you say like, should we back someone off or should we not? Like a session may look really hard and really demanding, but if over the last 7 days or so they've been prepared for sessions like that, then it's okay, versus if on average over the 7 days they've run 2 miles and we asked them today to run seven, like that's going to be a lot different than if we've prepared these athletes to run 6 miles and they ran 6 miles. Yeah. And then I break it down into like an acute to chronic workload ratio to understand, again, the progression, like A to C ratios last week divided by the last month. What's the average workload? And that kind of gets us this context of, are we progressing an athlete? Are we tapering an athlete? And how hard are we progressing an athlete throughout? So it gives our coaches a very detailed snapshot of what sessions look like and what their sessions over the last week or more have looked like to hopefully allow them to plan and to adjust going forward what their training sessions may be.
Awesome. Two pretty quick questions. One, I think I know the answer to this, but when you say it's a percentage of their max heart rate, how are you calculating or not calculating their max heart rate?
It's a good question. It's a tricky one. And that's where like, we don't plan using heart rate because there's so many adjustments in heart rate, even day to day, even max heart rate day to day. There's two ways in which we do it. Either A, if we have a team that comes back and does a cardio assessment when they get back, especially obviously a maximal cardio assessment, then we have our heart rate monitor. Obviously, all of this is collected through a heart rate monitor that Polar utilizes. And so we're able to see what is the maximal heart rate. And then once we plug that into the system, obviously we're able to break down what are percentages and where are those threshold percentages. If we have a team that doesn't necessarily do that, then what I look for is I tend to update it very regularly as we go throughout. We look at hard training sessions, or obviously once we get to game days, we may potentially see a max heart rate a little bit more. So it takes a little bit more alteration in heart rate because I've even seen that throughout a season. If you just take a max heart rate at the beginning of a season and you say, okay, this is 90% and like, let's use this for the rest of the season, you're going to miss a lot because that 21 championship season with women's lacrosse, we had one of those athletes. We came back, we ran a beep test. We ran a yo-yo test actually in January when they got back to campus. We got their max heart rates and this was a starter, a full minute player for us on defense, which our defense, we had very high demand of our defense in lacrosse at Division II. So a lot of clearing, a lot of action from our defenders. Her max heart rate during the yo-yo test in January was about 192 beats per minute. National championship game, Salem, Virginia in mid-May. It was 94 degrees outside, bright sunny day, humidity of Virginia in May. You expect a national championship game, so anxiety is very high, very demanding championship game. We won by like 2. So I got a max heart rate. There's no doubt in my mind that she maxed out that game. And her max heart rate during that game was 183 beats per minute. So her max heart rate went from low 190s to low 180s throughout the 5 months of the season. So if I just said our max heart rate is 192, 193, 194, whatever it was, like our 90% would eventually be almost above her actual max heart rate by the end of the season. So she would be spending at least what we'd be recording and reporting no time above 90. So those are things that we continually have to keep up with to understand that. So that's kind of how we measure it and how we
mentioned that there's high minute players and there's low minute players, but you also talked about the importance of producing volume throughout the season. What if I'm a player who's just not getting on the field? What's going to become of my fitness and my conditioning?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important topic when you're dealing with teams because you do have those high minute players and you do have those lower minute players or lower volume players. And more often than not, especially in our settings, Those low volume players are younger, right? They're freshmen, they're developmental players, and especially aerobic capacities that coaches expect. It takes years to build aerobic capacity that we see in the elite collegiate athletes nowadays. It's not just something we can get you to that level in 2 or 3 months from nothing. Like this is something that takes time. So um, with the athletes, it's always one we have to understand. We have to put in extra. It always varies where we do it. Like when you look at the elite level, what the elite level is going to do, the professional level, they're going to put in what we call top offs before games, after games, depending on where you sit. Like if you're someone that doesn't play, you go out the morning of a game and you put in a session. And then you come out and you warm up and you go through the whole process with your team. If you're someone that might play, like you're one of those second liners or third liners that, if something happens to a first liner, your volume becomes high. You obviously don't want to put in a session before the game. So normally it's like you top off after the game, depending on how much you did play. Working a little bit more collectively as a staff with teams, it's always a good idea on coaches. Like we always go game day, the day after a game, what we call game day plus one. That normally is a rest day for a lot of athletes, for a lot of teams, for a lot of, especially the high volumes. Like our soccer team played every Thursday, or almost every Thursday. They played Thursday, Sundays were their 2 game days. So Friday, it's not an off day. They're coming back. They're coming into training. And that's where I highly suggest to coaches that that's your opportunity. Your high volume athletes need recovery before the next game. The next game may be the next day if you have 2 games in 3 days, a like Thursday, Saturday situation. If it's soccer, you have a Thursday, Sunday, you have 2 games between days. We still need rest and recovery. So sit them. Like don't continue to drive your high volume athletes because you're eventually going to fatigue them throughout the season if you continue to pile on volume on them. Those developmental players, those lower volume players, that's their opportunity. Use that practice time, but use it with those players. I always say it provides 2 opportunities. And I think from a culture perspective, it helps. From a mental wellness perspective of an athlete, it helps. One, it allows you to develop those athletes. It allows the cardio fitness. It allows all the physical demands that they need to experience. Run them hard the day after a game and coach them the way you coach your starters, because that's their time then to show you what they have, their skill sets and their development. So I think those athletes appreciate getting the eyes of the coaches, and the athletes appreciate the opportunity. If you're one that says like, I think I should be playing, well, there's your opportunity to show you should be playing. And so I think that it's, whether it be a top off on game day, we aren't allowed to top off on game days in college. We aren't allowed to do extra work on game days.
Okay.
And so like we can't top off with athletes. Like we can't run athletes extra after games or anything if they didn't play. So like we don't necessarily have that opportunity. That's why we use day after game or day before game, depending on what we're doing. But as an athlete yourself, you have that opportunity if you have that knowledge, if you know you're going to play or not play. Again, if you know you traditionally don't play because you're in developmental, because you're a young athlete, put in that hard session before the game, the morning of a game or something like that. If you might play, don't potentially like burn that. If you need to step on that field that day, but if you didn't step on that field that day, then put in that session after the game or put in that session the next day to, again, what we call top off.
Yeah. It's, I think the crushing your athletes in preseason, that's like one of my big concerns or something I've witnessed. And that's me being hypocritical. The only sport coaching I've done is for children 6 years old and younger. But there's that. And then letting your younger athletes just deteriorate or not get better throughout the season. Those are the 2 things that as a strength coach or just as a fan of athletics, I'm just like, come on, like let's kind of like, let's make some change there. So
yeah, and unfortunately you see, and this is where I say like a misinterpretation of the strain. you end up with the same response. That's what's so hard. And it's so hard for coaches to recognize that. And I don't expect them to. And it's where like support and professionals like yourself and like myself are able to help. Is you end up with those when you're crushing your athletes to begin with. And like, again, if we look at soccer as the example, like we crush our athletes in August, they don't experience that maladaptation, that strain, that fatigue for another 4, 5, 6 weeks, but you get to mid-season and they're just dead on their feet. A lot of coaches interpret that as we're out of shape. And it's like, no, you aren't out of shape. You're tired. And it's hard to distinguish between being out of shape and tired. They both look the same when you're watching an athlete perform. And so you end up with like your high volume athletes that you've crushed, exhausted on their feet and can barely run because they're so tired. And then if you've allowed that gap to separate between your developmentals or your low volumes and your high volume starters, now your developmentals, now they aren't in shape and they look exactly the same as the starters because they aren't fit enough to do what you're asking them to do.
Yeah.
Now, coaches just turn to typically, we're out of shape. And it's like, well, if we're out of shape, it's because we haven't, as you said with the Rams coach, like we haven't prepared the athletes, which happens if we are just letting the backups stand and watch practice all day, every day. That happens. For our starters, it's probably fatigue. We're probably tired and we need some rest to recover.
Yeah. Sounds like maybe they need to measure mental toughness, you know?
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about like the capacities of athletes and performance, like I think there's some dangerous water to tread in some of those. But one of the words that's going to start to pop up here in upcoming years is resilience.
Yeah.
Resiliency. We talk about like in cardio people, we talk about like VO2 max, lactate threshold, exercise efficiency or running efficiency, cycling efficiency, whatever it may be. And people are going to start talking about resiliency. And I think anytime new terminology comes out, new measures come out, initially people jump and try and run with it without fully understanding it. And like, that's where I look at, like, they're going to associate resiliency of what we're trying to talk about with like mental toughness. And those are not the same things at all. Yeah. So, yeah.
Any comments on kind of what happens when there's an injury, whether it's a temporary or longer term, and how you might assist with the comeback?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I think sports scientists are great with data. And so when you look at data and assessments, sports scientists are scientists. So scientists follow the scientific method. And so we have a process and a plan for how we execute certain things. And it allows us to see the cleanest data to make the most educated decisions that we can as a staff. And so when you look at the assessments that might be made on athletes' return to play, whether it be, you look at typical like strength, endurance, things like that, how we measure those and how we place what we call criterion benchmarks, like where do we need to be to go on to the next phase of return to play. Sports scientists take a very like methodical approach to that measurement. And so we take that measurement now, we take that measurement a month from now. We know that the conditions were held consistent. And so the expectation, if that data point has changed, if we've gotten better, we know it's not because we did something different during the test, that it is the athlete has improved. And so like that's the value that I think any of us can apply when we apply this, or any of us can provide when we apply the scientific method to the assessments that we're taking. We need to take a very methodical approach to it, but that's really the lives of sports scientists. Sometimes it's some of the friction points that we do have a very high expectation of rigor in assessments. Are we performing the assessment in the morning or the evening? Are we performing how do we interpret the results when we perform a beep test in January versus a beep test in June when it's hot outside versus cold outside? Like those are some of the things that we think about and we can help with and assist with and interpret that I think assists. But when it comes to like return to play stuff, that's return to play needs assessments to say, why are we taking this progression? I think, in my opinion, a lot of people's opinion, like we need to measure, whether it be we need to measure by like muscle mass, like have we had atrophy or hypertrophy? We maybe need to measure that. We need to measure neuromuscular control. We need to measure range of motion. We need to measure flexibility. We need to measure balance. We need to measure strength and power and endurance. Like those measurements and where those thresholds can be, I think is where a sports scientist can step in and collaborate with those medical professionals and at in-stage rehab, those strength conditioning professionals to assist in, again, it's informed decision making now. It's
Yeah.
educated decision making, data informed decision making that we can make.
Yeah. It's easy to see why, we all have our tunnel vision sometimes, but you see the athletes that were told that they're cleared, but the medical professional they're working with deals mostly with people 3 to 4 times their age. And yes, they've returned to function. They can like put their pants on in the morning, but they're probably not ready to like decelerate in the middle of a game or what have you. So
Yeah, I mean, that's
when
just like, and obviously we've had some of these conversations. I have these conversations often with AT strength coaches, sport coaches. We're all experts in our own domains. Physicians and surgeons by no means are experts in sport. When a surgeon makes a surgical repair and they say, we're clear, that says my job is done. The surgery was successful. The structures are stable. Now they pass that on to the way it should be. They pass that on to now the athletic trainer, the strength coach, the physical therapist, whoever's involved, the sport coach, the fitness coach, to say, okay, we're here now, but we know competition is up here. Like we need to take you, like, how do we progress you now from here? You're a healthy athlete now to you're a competitive athlete now. And like, again, that's where like we don't have the expectation of athletes coming in from a long summer break where they maybe haven't trained as hard and we aren't going to play a game the next day. It's the same concept. Like we need to progress them. That surgeon is saying, my job's done. I'm going to rely on you guys, the sport professionals, to say this athlete is ready to return to that practice field and eventually return to that competitive field. That's the interpretation that many, including myself, believe should be made in those moments.
I remember what I thought the heart rate question was going to go faster, but it was good. It was a good answer, but I forgot my second quick question, or I think it's a quick one. Those charts that you're showing us, is that a certain like athlete management system, or is that you just being like an Excel hound and making some graphics?
Yeah, I mean that's the beauty. Those graphs are my own creation. So I use Excel and I use Power BI. So I live within the Microsoft environment to be able to create a lot of this stuff. So I've done a lot on my own, a lot of learning, a lot of things like that, to be able to manage some of this and look at some of this and make it make sense and make it make sense to our coaching staffs. There are athlete management systems, obviously, that do it for you. Polar does it for us. But if you want it customizable, you kind of got to do it yourself. And so it's kind of, when I talk to a lot of young sports scientists, young strength coaches, young personal trainers or physical therapists or ATs, learn Excel or Google Sheets or whatever environment or ecosystem you live in. Learn it and learn it well. Learn the functionality of it really well, because it will become really useful for you. If you learn it really well. And so like that's all my own creation with Excel and Power BI. Just because guess what? It's free. That's the beauty of it versus, getting a Rock Daisy or getting a Vault or getting something like that, costs a lot of money to an institution, thousands of dollars a year to an institution to be able to kind of manage all those data sources. But if you have a passion for it, like I do, like I'm sure a lot of us do, then you spend the time on weekends, nights, evenings, whenever you get some free time to be able to learn a little bit more about Excel. There's great people out there that have tutorials on it. on YouTube and everything else. ChatGPT is a lifesaver nowadays to be able to use to ask questions and figure out how to do things. But again, Excel, if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, Excel, Power BI, Microsoft Forms to be able to, much like Google Sheets or Google Forms and things, great to ask survey questions and be able to funnel it into Excel and do all that stuff and be able to automate it for you. But that's kind of how I do it rather than an
Yeah.
expensive
Yeah.
AMS.
We like free. You just
Free is great.
put
Free
in.
is great. Free is successful.
It only costs you hundreds of hours of
Yep.
diligent
Yeah,
work
I
and
guess, yeah.
learning, but
Yeah, but you get value out of it too. So it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
I
for
think that
sure.
you have a sense of it. Like I've always been that problem solver, as I'm sure many of us are. And so it's we love seeing that. We love, like, if you don't love that accomplishment, if you don't love that development in yourself, I think if you're in the sports performance world, yeah, it's going to be a struggle if you don't just enjoy um, putting in those hours just to learn something new.
What what do you think the future holds maybe for you? It was pretty cool to just see you create this position and just start helping over at Linwood, and kind of like the gift of time, to a lot of athletes and coaches over there. What do you see for your future coming up, and then maybe just the field of sports science? Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, my future, we see it a lot. Like what you see now, if you're at the collegiate level, at the Power Four level, um, a lot of these types of positions are there, are opening, um, or going to be. And so we see some very successful programs with them in sports science. I personally like bridging the gap between academics and athletics. So I see myself growing in that space from that regard here at Lindenwood, to be able to hopefully develop a strong and even stronger relationship than we already have. Be able to expand to more teams, which in large part means my future directly will be getting more and more and more students involved. And I do a lot of this work with some interns, with a few small interns, but as like I've had conversations about basketball, I've had conversations with, and I'm working a little bit with like women's hockey, but I've had a little conversation with hockey. Again, our rugby squads, our track and field squads, like all the different teams that we have, it's gonna grow outwards because I'm very optimistic that it's going to continue to be successful here. And so the more success you have, the more teams look at that aren't currently involved that will want to be involved, and I want them to be involved. And so I'm going to see my sphere grow. And that largely means I only have so much capacity. I'm going to have more interns. I'm going to have more students working with me to be able to directly work with these teams. And now, like, my job is to educate them and assist them. And if there are super high level interactions and conversations and collaborations that I need to have, then that's where I step in rather than I would love to have my student interns do a lot of the day-to-day work that I currently do as that sphere starts to grow. As far as a field, I do believe what we're seeing in this field is a little bit of what we call accelerated change. Accelerated change, I think we had talked about it, like Moore's Law. We're seeing a growth, an exponential growth in this field. When you think back, like GPS technology largely was born out of the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Like Catapult started in Australia, working with the Australian athletes and the AIS. And so the Sydney Games was really the world exposure to GPS technology and athletes. That was a quarter century ago. Like it has not been that long ago. And we've seen now, like force plate technology didn't really exist in the strength and conditioning space. That was in the biomechanical lab space, like physics classrooms. Like that was not in strength and conditioning centers until the last decade. Like we're seeing such a rapid growth. We see wearable technology with whoops and auras, or like whoop bands and aura rings and all this stuff as well. We're seeing a rapid growth and an accelerated growth in sports technology. That to me is going to lead to a fork in the road, and we're starting to see it. I think we're going to start to see athlete pushback. We're going to start to see coach pushback, etc. And with accelerated growth, for acceleration to continue in it, you need to have proportional sociocultural change, which if the coaching ecosystem doesn't stay up with the changes in technology and sports science, that's where we'll have conflict. And so I'm going to see a fork in we're going to see a fork in the road, and we're going to see people that are successful and teams and institutions that are successful because everyone plays in the sandbox really well, and we educate really well, and we use only the necessary tools to get the answers that we want to the questions that we have. And we're going to see those that go down a bad route of a lot of conflict and a lot of friction, a lot of resistance, because of power dynamics and everything else, because of a lack of appropriate sociocultural changes within the environment. And so I think we're going to see a very quick split.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see people be very successful. And I think we're going to see people that start to resent, especially sports technology in our field, because of that.
I don't think I have this formulated into a clean question, and I don't know if this is a good time for it, if I should have asked it an hour ago. When you were an athlete, what are some differences you think would have been around with the inclusion of a sports scientist?
Oh man, I was blessed in that like my track coach when I was at Fresno State was an exercise science graduate, had a master's in exercise science, and he did what many wouldn't at that time. He did ask a lot of questions. At that time, we couldn't measure as well quite as much things as we can nowadays. We didn't have the wearables. Like I remember I was running around with one of the original Garmin Forerunners that was really for like trail runners and orienteering and stuff. Is a brick on our wrist versus what we see in Garmin nowadays. And so like we had some of that exposure to that when I was a track athlete in the early 2000s there. My coach asked us every day 2 questions. We had a survey essentially. I don't even remember what website we used, but we entered our information into a website that was how much did we run and what's our resting heart rate, right? So it allowed him to see and he knew because he was programming, and track is super, I may offend some, but it's much easier to program for because you're dealing with very easy numbers and there's not all the stuff that we talk about with soccer and all that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how many miles did you run today? And what's your resting heart rate? So we had to take our resting heart rate every morning when we woke up. And he said, basically, if we see an elevated resting heart rate over the course of in 3 consecutive days, we're going to back off of training. Right. So he understood stress and strain back then, even before I did. I didn't know what those terms meant. And I'm not sure he would have termed them that back then, but he understood what he was asking us to do and what our response was. And he asked us that. So I was blessed with that of the very ground level of what you could call sports science nowadays. But man, what we see now with, again, especially the neuromuscular stuff, the things like that, the force plates that we can use and we can use every day, the very diverse periodization that we use nowadays, and that in and of itself, we knew linear periodization back then. We knew it was the beginnings, a little bit of some stuff, obviously, in undulating periodization and things and block periodization. But now with like tactical periodization and all these things, like these periodized models that are coming out nowadays because we have the technology we do, it is a whole new world. But when I was an athlete, thankfully, I was blessed with a coach that understood a little bit of that and understood and was humanistic enough, I guess you could say, to ask us for an objective measure of how we're feeling like a resting heart rate.
Hey, shout out to Fresno State coach. Yeah.
Yeah, Joe Gonzalez, man. What a guy. I had a lot, obviously,
sweet.
like as any athlete, you have a lot of conflict, you have a lot of stuff like that, but I can look back at my time and say, man, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for some of those beginnings with my faculty and my staff, that I was able to work with as an undergraduate.
Yeah, that's huge. Very cool. Well, I was debating about throwing that question out. I'm glad that I did. So you can answer this. It can be sport related. It can be anything. You can tell everybody to get a dog if you want to, as a dog father.
Yes.
Um, this podcast, I call it the Winning Wellness Podcast, and that's kind of like two sides of the coin. One is that some people are not well; they need to win their wellness. They need to make better decisions just to get into what most people would consider a state of average or above average. And then the other side is, yeah, there's athletes and there's people that are pushing their limits and they're ambitious with their health and their achievements, and they need to win well. So you can take it in kind of any direction you want to. But what's one or two things that people should do to just improve in one of those ways?
Um, the biggest thing that I see, I mean, two things that I see that separate some people that successful and potentially less successful, and even within the successful can striate those that are super successful and those that are moderately successful is first and foremost like separation from, in my mind, to success and not success is routine and habit. We have to not only form them, um, we have to be able to form our proper habits, and our habits will create our routines. But we need to understand them and understand our rhythms, our routines, our habits. And I think when we understand them and the effects that they can have, whether it be a bedtime routine, a workout routine, a wake up routine, it took me a long time to figure all this out. And in fact, like, in reality, reading, like, I think it's James Clear, The Road to Atomic Habits, it took me a long time. Like, I read that book just a few years ago, and I finally, like, it clicked with me together. Like, I was one of those people that I might have had routines, but I didn't understand them. So I didn't understand if I changed routine, what effect it had on me. But to be able to build some of those routines and how we do it, and then, or some of those habits and how our routines can affect us, are extremely meaningful. And I think it's be purposeful with it. The second piece of that was woven a little bit in there. Like, once we have our routines and our habits, our healthy routines, um, it's educating and understanding. I think that's the separation. I talk about it with athletes of, like, we have athletes that do the right thing and athletes that don't do the right thing. We have athletes that have routines and habits and athletes that don't have routines and habits. And then once we have, when we have them, the next kind of delineation within there is, are we educated enough to understand? Do we educate ourselves well enough to understand the effect these habits are having on us and the effect of any deflection from our habits may have on us? That knowledge, to me, even though the routine may be the same, we have people that are in routines just because, well, that's the routine. That's the way I was for a long time after I got my PhD. Was I was in a routine. I didn't think a lot about it. And, in reality, I probably wasn't, um, winning all that well, versus just this last, half decade of my time at Lindenwood, after I had some opportunity to read a little bit more and expand my knowledge and really focus on, like, when I don't do this, this is how I feel and this is the effect. And then again, why is that the case? And once we understand a little bit more about why that's the case, it reinforces why we should have that habit. So I do truly think it's habits and routines is kind of first and foremost in regards to kind of winning well. And then, once we have habits and routines, it's really the knowledge that surrounds those habits and routines that can propel us even further, to really successfully winning well.
I love that. That's great. It's a great answer. We've had some good answers on the show so far, but that's pretty high up there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Is there anything we haven't talked about today that you think we should or to bring up?
The biggest piece that I think about for those that are working with athletes, especially, or physically fit individuals, high physical activity individuals, recovery, rest, sleep, things like that. When we talk about recovery strategies with a lot of people, again, sports technology gets into this space, and we have Normatec boots and we have massage guns and we have all these types of things. Those are small pebbles compared to the big boulders of proper sleep and nutrition. If you don't have proper sleep and nutrition, those are the 1% compared to the 90% effect you can have when you have proper sleep and nutrition. So a lot of the discussion that we may have, it's like nutrition and supplementation, right? Like supplements won't help you if your nutrition isn't, if your diet's not right. They won't maximize you if your diet's not right. They don't make up for it. Normatec boots are not going to make up for a lack of sleep the night before, like things like that. And so I think that's so vital to understand. And when we talk about like the number one key thing, find your kind of nightly routine to understand our sleep as well as possible. That to me is something when I look at our athletes and I look at myself, that can separate us, that can make us feel so much better every day that we get up and we step on the competitive fields. Once we understand what helps us sleep well, and that we actually get proper sleep, that to me is unmatchable in what we can do to recover. Again, we spoke so much about what we do from a stress perspective and everything, but that strain that we experience is reliant upon the recovery strategies that we use. And, people talk about like overtraining and things like that. And it's sometimes it can be just as much under recovery as it is overtraining. And so we need to understand what our nightly routines, especially that surround sleep, are. Very vital if you're an athlete, if you're someone working with athletes or people that are very physically active, military, things like that. Being able to get good sleep and educate how to get good sleep is so vital.
Yeah. It's powerful. I tell everybody it's a superpower. It's if you've got that in check, brain, body, emotions, whatever, everything goes better.
Yeah. I just wish there was better terms, we have it here at Linwood now. I've seen videos of other places, we have recovery rooms nowadays, and what exists in recovery rooms, some I think is good. Giving yourself or your athletes a nice quiet space mentally to recover, vital. That is a zero cost, very important aspect of recovery is quiet space or a space and time to recharge mentally. But then again, we see the Normatec boots, we see the massage guns, we see whether it be heat packs, cold packs, whatever it may be. And it's like, I fear with young athletes, if we're working with high school, college athletes, people like that, I fear using that word recovery room. That's what I fear they're going to view that as, I went in the recovery room, I should be recovered. And
Oh
it's
yeah.
like, well, you also didn't eat lunch today, and like, so there's things like that I'm like, you also for dinner had a salad and like, and so it's things like that I'm like, I fear that they're going to understand that as recovery and not things that they're in more control of. And like, that's my biggest thing that I see. Like, I see all the Instagram videos and everything of places like the Power Four conferences that are like, look at these recovery rooms. And again, like we have one at Linwood now. I fear the mentality of an athlete stepping in that room and thinking that is recovery, because it's
Yeah.
just not.
Yeah. It's a lot to learn, and to put all that stuff in an 18-year-old or even a 22-year-old's brain. Like, all they see is the highlights of people working hard all the time. Do they ever see how important sleep is, or so you just, and then we can be hypocrites too. Like when we got to take care of stuff, what's the first thing that gets flushed down the toilet for us is sleep. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah. I mean, I talk about it a lot with our coaching staffs on what we do or don't do, what we decide to do or not do. Man, the amount, like going back to my time at Fresno State, the amount that is asked of college athletes nowadays is wild. The
yeah,
amount that is asked of youth athletes nowadays. I work with a local high school team that like last year it's a local girls lacrosse team that, I mean, they played 11 games in the month of March or the month of April. I can't remember which month. 11 games in 30 days. Like sometimes multiple games a day and things like that. And like, we don't ask our college athletes to do that at all. I don't think I was really ever asked to do that. I played rec league like growing up or whatever. I was never, maybe some tournament basketball stuff, but
Yeah.
not in soccer, not in like some of these other sports that we play.
Yeah.
Like the demand on these athletes' time and energy and everything is wild nowadays. And like I can only sympathize with them and again try and like all we can do is try and educate them as best as possible, but we have to understand that it is not what we experienced as athletes growing up,
Yeah.
because and now as college athletes, NIL and the stress that that may place on them, and like it's so much nowadays that they're dealing with that I didn't have to deal with as a college athlete. So we I think it's best for our athletes, like, people mention mental toughness. I think mental toughness, my own personal belief is that it comes from their support system. How we support our athletes will lead to the building of mental toughness, not running someone into the ground, not lifting them heavier every day. It is how do we support and embrace our athletes is going to create a mental toughness in them. I relate it a lot to trust. It's going to build a lot of trust in them. And we have to understand that the demand on them is so high outside of them practicing and playing. And once we do that and we can sympathize with them and stuff, I think it builds a lot of that within them. But it's wild what they do nowadays.
Yeah. And you talk about them being in the recovery room with the Normatec boots or whatever, and they'll be on the boots with the phone in front of their face
Yeah.
with like
Yeah.
constant stimulation and things like that. And
Oh
it's just
man.
yeah.
It's so tough and it's so hard to filter that stuff out. And I always tell them, like, listen, I was a college athlete too. So I'll tell you things I know, but I'm definitely going to meet you in the middle on some things. Like I understand there's some things that we may know is physically appropriate from a recovery perspective, from everything, from an advice perspective. But I'm going to understand that you're a college student, with like our college group. Like I'm going to understand that. And there's times I like sleep advice, don't be in front of a screen an hour before bedtime. For a college student, let alone a college athlete, that's almost impossible
Yeah.
nowadays. And so like where can we compromise and where can we meet in the middle and what advice can we give that is not like you can't do that? Like, and if they do it, like it's like, why did you do that? It's like, well, that like it's such a high expectation to place on them. And I think it's unrealistic. Especially given the social environment they're in and everything else. So yeah, the doom scrolling stuff is tough. That's
Yeah.
just so tough.
Those college athletes, one thing that kind of surprised me a while back is learning that college athletes will have more mental health issues than non-athletes at college. Because I'm thinking like, okay, they're healthy enough to have it together to be on a team. They're physically healthy because they can go out and perform. They automatically have a support system with like built-in friendships and leadership in the form of coaches and maybe like a involved like academic advisor. But all the stress of the workload of the training and the pressure and all that stuff, it actually overcomes all that good stuff, and they get it's something like 2% more common, something along those lines. But
I can see it. I mean, again, I deal with it as an academic advisor quite regularly it goes back like students looking for internships, right? If I'm dealing with a non-athlete college student, they could take an internship whenever. Again, like they may have jobs and stuff, so I'm not going to downplay that, but like it's a little bit, their time is a little bit different than what we look at as like with the college athletes. And when it comes to signing up for classes and things like that, the stresses that they place based on when practices and they have no control over it. You see it on their faces, you see it in their body language. You can see that stress in them, and you can understand how they may be at like predisposed a little bit more to some mental challenges than non-athletes might be, let alone the like, am I going to play or not play?
yeah,
Can I make it on this team or not make it, especially as freshmen, coming as freshmen to like a team like our women's soccer team next year. You're coming into the OVC champions. That pressure or that mental state of like, can I play for this team? Imposter syndrome, things like that. They're like, I mean, it's real. And so I can see how it could be higher percentage.
If anybody's listening wants to reach out to you, is there an avenue that'd be all right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on, I mean, LinkedIn and Instagram. Reach out. I mean, Instagram, actually, I have two. I run kind of two. I run my own personal one, but I also have like an LU Sports Science Instagram if you want to follow along with more of the sports science side of my life versus, potentially my dog side of my life. And so like I have Instagram for that. So again, it's either just search my name, Kyle Sunderland, or search LU Sports Science, and those pop up. LinkedIn, if you want to connect professionally, that is obviously where a lot of our profession is shifting towards some LinkedIn stuff and everything. So feel free to reach out on there as well. I'm always open. It's what I say in the classroom. It's what I sell to our coaching staffs. I don't hide anything. It's important to me to grow the sport, to grow the professions, that people understand what other people are doing. And maybe, some of the successes and some of the challenges that they faced along the way. So feel free to reach out, and I'll answer the best I can or connect with you as best I can.
Thank you very much. This is great. I'll kind of close it out, and then we can chat for another second.
Thank you for listening to the Winning Wellness Podcast. Please keep in mind that all views expressed within the show are not a reflection of any universities or organizations that I may be affiliated with. If you have any questions or suggestions for future shows, please reach out through Instagram, where I can be found with the title name of Mitch Schwartzman.